We are 2 months away from the first night of the 2025 NFL Draft up in Green Bay. And this week, the Carolina Panthers and the rest of the NFL world is up in Indianapolis for the annual scouting combine. Which prospects should the Panthers be watching, and what are their top needs heading into free agency? We'll talk about that right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays throughout the entirety of the offseason, I'm right here answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. We are 2 months away from the first night of the 2025 NFL Draft, which I found out finally today before recording the show is going to be up in Green Bay at Lambeau Field. And what a perfect place to have it. Now, I do question whether the weather's going to be great in late April, even in Wisconsin, but I'm sure it's going to be an awesome night, and it will be a very big night for the Carolina Panthers as they will be selecting right now here on Monday, February 24th. They'll be selecting 8th overall, and that is a spot where they could get a plug-and-play edge rusher, possibly a starting corner if they want to do that, a defensive tackle. There are a litany of positions defensively that Carolina needs to address this offseason, whether it's in a couple of weeks in free agency or if it's later on, and also including later on 2 months from now in the draft. So we're going to talk about the draft today, as this is a huge draft week, as we all know, with the NFL Scouting Combine going on this week in Indianapolis. All of the TV portion that you're going to want to watch will be over the weekend. All of the business of what matters most for these teams is going to be happening over the course of the next couple of days. We will hear from both Dave Canales and Dan Morgan either on Tuesday or Wednesday, but I'll be breaking it down here on the show like I did last year, like I've done in past years, when I have the Panthers head coach and GM speak to the media there at the Combine up in Indianapolis. We want to focus in on some prospects that you should be watching from home this weekend, and some prospects that the Carolina Panthers obviously should be interested in. And I saw a really good tweet a couple of weeks ago. It was a retweet from our guy Benjamin Albright out there in Denver, who does a fantastic job of covering the Denver Broncos. Was just going over the process of, do these teams talk to all these players and yada, yada, yada. And he went out and let people know every team meets up every player at the Senior Bowl and Shrine Game, and that's just something for you to know. So the Panthers have already met with all these players, a lot of them, prior to the Combine. This will be a week where they'll have more in-depth conversations with guys that they are interested in. So just a little bit of a background information I want to provide to you heading into this Combine week. But let's talk about the high priority needs for Carolina right now, prior to free agency, but really looking ahead 2 months from now to the NFL draft. Two positions that I really look at where Carolina, if they're drafting today, they have to address are edge rusher and defensive tackle. We spent the last couple of weeks discussing the entirety of the roster offensively, defensively, and just looking at what the needs are for this team, and looking at just how poor this Panthers defense was last year at stopping the run, at getting to the passer, and just overall, if they want to have the improvement that the offense had this past year, they need to go about this offseason in a similar manner, and that's throwing money and resources at the defensive line, at that edge rusher spot. They did it last year by spending a bunch of money on Robert Hunt and on Damian Lewis, moving Austin Corbett there to center, and they got Bryce some weapons as well on the outside. But this year they have to be focused on rebuilding the defensive line. They got a nice foundation there with Derek Brown. Ashawn Robinson, I think, should be back in a starting role. But edge rusher-wise, sure, I think that Wonnum can be a solid player in Carolina, but he's not a sure thing. Clowney, his best days are well behind him at this point in time. They need to address these two positions. And looking over at edge rusher, this has been the spot that I have seen most mocked for Carolina to take a player 8th overall. And the player who has continuously been mocked for the most part, they are at 8th overall, is Jalen Walker, the linebacker / edge rusher at the University of Georgia, who, looking at NFL.com, and these are some prospect grade ratings that they put out there, is a 6.45 prospect grade, which means he will become a good starter within 2 years. So maybe not this year in 2025, but certainly by 2026, the expectation is that Jalen Walker will be an impact player in the NFL. And looking at a recent mock draft from Daniel Jeremiah of the NFL Network, he mocked Carolina, selecting Jalen Walker 8th overall, saying the Panthers have needs all over the defensive side of the ball and could be an obvious trade down candidate, which is certainly interesting in this conversation. If someone wants to make a move up the board, if they stay put, Walker would be a versatile playmaker for them. He offers enormous upside as a pass rusher, and that's what Carolina absolutely needs, is a player who offers enormous upside as a pass rusher. That is not DJ Johnson. That is not DJ Wonnum, even though I think he can be a solid one, not enormous upside. And that was coming out of South Carolina way back when, Jadeveon Clowney. But in 2025, that ain't him. They need someone of this caliber, of this talent level. And Lance Zierlein, also the NFL Network, did some nice overviews of some of these prospects we're going to talk about today. He said some see Walker as a tweener, while others view him as a hybrid. Either way, Walker could go. His career snap count is split between edge and linebacker, and his leadership is famous in the Georgia building. I guess not as famous enough to get those boys to stop speeding all the damn time. He's still working to fine-tune his instincts and efficiency as an off-ball linebacker, but has to take on and closing bursts, become a productive pro at that spot. He's tough but small as an early down edge rusher, but his athletic talent and suddenness to attack both edges make him a menace for tackles. The most valuable usage for Walker is likely to come as an early down linebacker who can rush off the edge or match up across the line as a blitzer on passing downs. And I think right now, what you want to do is go out there and rush the passer. You can figure out everything else later. Just get out there, get him on the field, and on those third downs, have him line up against that tackle, that speed rush, make those moves, and get the quarterback on the ground. Like, that's what you're asking from Jalen Walker early on. I know Ejiro Vero's big on his edge rush to be able to set the edge as far as stopping the run, and that is important, as this team did give up 3,000 plus rushing yards this past season. 3,057 to be exact rushing yards, which is an embarrassment. But the guys he has setting the edge aren't really guys who are going to be getting after the passer, and that's what Jalen Walker could do. Another prospect that I see mocked, at least I have seen, maybe not as recently, but I have seen him mocked to Carolina before, is a teammate of Jalen Walker who actually has a higher prospect grade according to the NFL Network with a 6.47, so 0.02 better than Jalen Walker. That is Mykel Williams. And if you watch these two guys against Texas, and Texas has Kelvin Banks, who is going to be maybe the first or second tackle, either him or Will Campbell at LSU will be the top two tackles taken in the NFL draft, likely both taken in the top 10. He got wore out. Him and his buddy Cam Williams, who's also in this draft class, the right tackle from Texas, both struggled against Jalen Walker and Mykel Williams twice. First in Austin, then in Atlanta in the SEC title game. And Banks is a dude. And Williams pretty damn good too. So these guys may not have had the big numbers that you would expect for somebody being drafted this high. And that's kind of similar to their buddy Trevon Walker, who was drafted number 1 overall by Jacksonville a couple years ago. And he's been just okay so far for the Jags. Mykel Williams, according to Lance Zierlein, has an upside prospect. Well, he's an upside prospect with loads of traits. Williams simply needs more snaps, more time to fill out his frame. He's an explosive athlete who uses an exceptional length to keep tackles and tight ends at the end of his punch. He plays a little too tall at the point and needs to get stronger to shed blocks more quickly, but he plays with good physicality in the trenches and is never pushed around, which love to hear that. He's still learning moves and counters, but already has a big bull rush and good secondary effort in the closing burst to become a sack blanket in the pocket. He's not there yet, but Williams's improvement to become an impactful 4-3 base and feels inevitable. So to become an impactful 4-3 base end feels inevitable, which is not necessarily what they run in Carolina. So he may not be the guy that you're looking at just based off of the scheme is being run right now. But down the road, like Dan Morgan understands, like this is his call. This is going to be the call of that scouting department. Yes, you got to fit these guys into the scheme, but also you need to fit your scheme around the players more than anything. So we'll see how that works out. So he's another one to look at there. Possibly at 8. Maybe that might be more of a trade back. But another player, at least looking at the latest mock, Mike Green from Marshall. He is going 9th overall, according to Daniel Jeremiah, to the New Orleans Saints. So he will be right there in range for Carolina. And I would imagine he'd be on the board there at 8 if they wanted him. Had a monster season, albeit playing in the Sun Belt, if you want to couch it that way. But this dude led the FBS with 17 sacks, which is ridiculous. Ranked 2nd with 22.5 tackles for loss. Led the team with 3 forced fumbles. And his player comp is another former G5 prospect who you may be familiar with, depending upon your college allegiances, Alex Highsmith, who played here at Charlotte for the 49ers, and he's been a really successful pro right now. Lance Erline says that Mike Green is a high-energy pass rusher with productivity and a method of play that should translate to the next level. Green displays a natural and instinctive rush, utilizing loose hips and a series of moves and counters that can open doors with force or finesse. He's very physical with notes of violence in the way he attacks blockers in both phases. His explosiveness allows him to penetrate gaps, play around, or through the protection edges and change direction quickly to finish into the backfield. He relentlessly presses forward, but can run out of gas due to his hot running motor, which fine by me. Hot running motor, sign me up. Teams might wish he were heavier and longer, but he's willful, skilled, and powerful with the ability to create enormous matchup concerns as an edge rusher on the next level. This is not an organization that necessarily should ever be looking at somebody and say, like, oh, man, I wish he was bigger. He's maybe too small, because one of the greatest players in the whole mantra of what this team is Sam Mills, an undersized linebacker who's now in Canton and will always have his stamp on this franchise for the rest of all time. Even if David Tepper and this organization's ownership want to kind of wash away, keep pounding the way they have in years past, that's never going to be the case. So if Mike Green, I'm not saying that's who he is, but if he's undersized and has a ticker bigger than most of these guys and is not going to give up and he can produce, because you want to look at the guys like Williams and Walker who I've seen mocked at the edge rusher spot to Carolina at 8, they don't nearly have the production as Mike Green had in one season. And I'm going back right now looking at Jalen Walker's college stats. And I'm not trying to sit here and say that Jalen Walker cannot go out there and be a double-digit sack guy and be a high-impact player here in Carolina or in the NFL, wherever he goes. He had 12.5 sacks in 3 seasons at Georgia. Again, Mike Green had 17. I understand in the Sun Belt, you're telling me that can't translate to the SEC. Living in this portal era, we're seeing plenty of guys go from the G5, hell, go from FCS. Jared Verse, remember him? Was at Albany, went to FSU, All-American, came back, All-American again, goes to the NFL. A beast. That dude 3 years ago was playing at Albany, and now he's one of the already early young pass rushers in the NFL that is up and coming. So I don't want to really hear that much about level. Can you play or can you not play? And Georgia has got a lot of guys. So sometimes you got to wait your turn. Totally understand that. And then looking over to at Michael Williams, 14 sacks total in his career there in Athens in those 3 seasons. So production right there, check, check, check. And when you're looking at Mike Green, so that is somebody who I'm also very interested in. Those are the 3 guys I would think that if at 8, they're probably who Carolina is looking at. Also, just as far as prospects for you to watch, they would be that. That would be it. Now, moving forward, if they're going to trade back, which Daniel Jeremiah mentioned, that could be a possibility for Carolina. Shamar Stewart out of A&M, Donovan Ezeraku out of Boston College, who, quite frankly, I love. And I don't know, man. We're talking about production. That guy produced twice out of the last 3 years in the ACC, and he had an injury-plagued season back in 2023. If he had not, he would have been right up there in these conversations a year ago during the 2024 draft cycle. I'll be all over him. I like him, quite honestly. James Pierce Jr. is a local guy. I don't know as far as like the run stopping aspect, if he's the biggest fit. But I like Ezraku more than Stewart and Pierce, and hell, he's high up there. I mean, when I look at the other guys, Green, Williams, and Walker, like I can't get over what Jalen Walker and Michael Williams did against Texas twice. That's the thing that has me thinking like those guys over Ezraku. But man, Donovan's good. So those are 6 prospects to watch, and 3 that may be right there at 8 for Carolina to go after in 2 months' time. Defensive tackle is also the other high priority position. We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth-quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Right now, for me, edge rusher would be the top priority for Carolina, but pretty close second. If we're looking at a 1A, 1B situation, 1B, and could be a 1A in your book. And I would not necessarily argue with you at all because they're both on the line of scrimmage at the defensive line position, but defensive tackle. We looked at the last 2 years, Shy Tuttle, local guy, actually drove by his high school the other day in North Davidson. Nick's Hamburgers up there in Welcome for the folks who understand, like, the 40-minute wait's a little ridiculous, but pretty good if you're ever up there in Welcome, North Carolina by chance, which I was on my way back up to the alma mater to go watch them lose on Saturday. But drove by Shy Tuttle's old stomping grounds, North Davidson High School, which is had a decent amount of talent come out of there over the years, but he has not shown that talent in Carolina the last couple of seasons outside of maybe a handful of games. And he is now in a position where Carolina either is going to cut him as he has a $1 million roster bonus that's due on March 14th, third day of the new league year, or they're going to find a way to rework that deal. And I would preferably have him rework that deal. And it hits his money. It's a business. I totally get it. Like, if you want to keep your money, man, do it. You earned it. They gave you the contract. Have you lived up to it? Not necessarily, but a deal's a deal. But I would still love to see, as far as for Carolina depth-wise, to have him come back in a reduced role as a backup. And I do think that would help the Panthers as far as trying to get that defensive line back up to par coming up here in 2025. But they got to find a nose tackle, a true nose tackle. And for me, I feel like free agency is where they need to do it, which is kind of why I'm saying edge rusher is the top priority as far as the draft goes, just 2 months out without knowing what's going to happen in a couple weeks' time, which is when people ask me, like, what should they do at 8? It's like, I don't know, because I don't know who they're going to sign in free agency. And a lot of times that's going to dictate what they do in the draft. Like, you want to set yourself up to be best player available, but you have to look at the market and are there edge rushers going to be available to you that can truly come in and raise the ceiling for Carolina and raise the floor as well? Or are you really just going to have to address that in April in Green Bay? Like, that's something that's always important to why, as I try to tell you, you got to give me some time when it comes to draft conversation, because we can talk about the prospects. A lot of it's going to be wasted breath because these guys are not going to all play for the Carolina Panthers, of course, but I got to know what they did in March before I can really focus in on what they're going to do in April. But this week's about the draft, and this week's about them looking at defensive tackles and you watching some prospects. And the one that NFL Network right now has as the top defensive tackle based off a prospect grade with a 6.71 is Walter Nolen. And that checks out because that dude coming out of the Knoxville area was the #1 overall high school recruit, went down to A&M. Cash, just throwing that out there. But, you know, it's legal now, I suppose. But the NIL went down there, got a bunch of cash, go play for A&M. But then the whole situation with Jimbo, he left to go to Ole Miss, and they threw a bag at him. And, well, what do you know? The Ole Miss Rebels are still the Ole Miss Rebels and could not get it done. But Walter Nolen, he's a good player, man. And that prospect grade equals year 1 starter. And that is music to my ears because the Carolina Panthers need someone to instantly come in at that nose tackle spot and be an impact player. Lance Zierlein saying Nolen has NFL starting size, but won't blow you away with physical traits. However, he gains a quick advantage with his explosiveness into contact and ability to beat up blockers when singled up. He has the athletic talent to play in the gaps, but needs to play with better hands, keep himself clean at the point of attack. He wins as a rusher with his athleticism and play strength and doesn't need to be schemed for. The pass rush still requires refinement, which is interesting. I know we talked about Derek Brown and his pass rush, and Todd Wash, the defensive line coach in Carolina, said a couple years ago he wanted to get him there. We did see Ashawn Robinson have a career year as a pass rusher from the interior, so the hope is Derek Brown coming back can do something similar this upcoming season. But going back to Walter Nolen, the pass rush still requires refinement, but he already flashes quick win moves that foreshadow good pressure and sack production as a pro. Nolan's blend of explosiveness and playmaking talent create high upside as a 3-down interior alignment, and that's what I like to hear. So he would be the top one and will be available, I imagine, at 8, depending on what mock draft you're looking at. And this is all an educated guess when you look at what Daniel Jeremiah puts out there, what Mile Kiper puts out there, and what Jordan Reed, Matt Miller, all those name NFL draft people, what they're putting out there is a lot of source information, and also just like looking at what's clearly in front of you, what the team needs are. Your buddy who decided to fire up PFF, that's not necessarily the reality of the situation. But right now, depending on what you look at, Mason Graham is either gone before Carolina's on the board, or he's on the board and Carolina passes up, because it looks like the edge rusher, in my opinion, and a lot of draft analysts' opinions, is the top position Carolina should be looking to address there at 8th overall right now, 2 months away from the draft, not knowing what they're going to do in free agency. Like a Myles Garrett trade probably changes things, I would think. But he has a prospect grade of 6.49, which also equals becoming a good starter within 2 years. So maybe not this year, but certainly in 2026. And the breakdown from Lance Zierlein says that Mason Graham is a 3 technique who provides activity, effort, strength, and quickness. Graham's first step quickness makes interior disruption inevitable. He has the instant read and response to regularly beat lateral blocks. He's stout at the point of attack with great leverage and body control, but will lose some ground against double teams. Graham's lack of length makes it tougher for him to find quick wins as a rusher, but he more than makes up for it with his activity level and foot quickness. Harmonious hands, which is just, the way that they describe these guys. Harmonious hands and feet are the catalyst for his edge as counters, while his extended effort and closing bursts help him get home. He may not dominate as a pro, but his strength, body control, and quickness should allow him to play his brand of ball and become a good starter in an upfield defensive front. I do think this is a guy who can definitely help you day one stop the run. So you look at Michigan the last 2 years. I know this past fall, the offense was a disaster until the very end, where they started to get some wins like against Ohio State and against Alabama. Everybody was complaining about that Alabama team not going to the playoff. They couldn't even beat this Michigan team. But Mason Graham, good player. Kenneth Grant also, like those guys were catalysts helping them win a national championship back in 2023 when Jim Harbaugh was still the head coach. But Walter Nolen, Mason Graham, those are the guys at 8. If Carolina is able to get an edge rusher who they feel good about, or maybe 2 in free agency, like then I think defensive tackle becomes that spot to address, especially if they miss out on them during free agency next month. Walter Nolen, Mason Graham, those guys could be on the board, probably will be on the board there at 8, and they would make sense. Now, if they want to trade back, wait till later on in the second round, guys like Kenneth Grant, Darius Alexander out of Toledo, Derek Harmon out of Oregon, Tyleik Williams out of Ohio State, Alfred Collins, Texas, Shamar Turner, A&M, TJ Sanders from right down the road, South Carolina. Those are some other names, prospects for you to monitor and watch this weekend up there in Indianapolis. So those are the top priorities and prospects that you should really be watching. What about some positions and prospects that I wouldn't hate for Carolina to go out there and to address and to take, and also a couple other spots that could make sense? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Edge rusher, defensive tackle, I don't think there's much of an argument that those right now are the top 2 needs for the Panthers just this offseason alone. And looking ahead 2 months from now at the draft, those would be the top 2 positions if Carolina somehow is unable to address them during free agency, which I do not think will be the case. I think at least one of those gets addressed, maybe even both of them gets addressed. They're going to bring in maybe a secondary option, but they need to find a starter, certainly at nose tackle coming up here in March. And if they don't, you get it done in the draft. Edge rusher, you may wait as you have Clowney coming back. You have Woodham coming back. DJ Johnson, I suppose, is going to come back, and maybe he's going to show us some more in 2025. Don't hold your breath, but maybe. So certainly nose tackle, defensive tackle, whatever you want, however you want to describe it, that needs to be addressed in March and could again later on in April up at the NFL draft in Green Bay. But some other spots that I honestly wouldn't hate to see Carolina go out there and address wide receiver. I look at this wide receiver group. I've been pretty straightforward that I would love to see them try to get number one, and we'll see what happens with the franchise tag of T. Higgins up in Cincinnati. I'm imagining that they slap it on him again if they're not able to get a new deal, and he probably stays in Cincinnati, but maybe they trade him. I think he's probably going to stick there with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, and they're going to keep things rolling there offensively up in the fake Queen City. I shouldn't even call it fake Queen City because that kind of, legitimizes them for whatever reason. But either way, I would love to see that happen, but it's probably more of like a floor raising than like raising the ceiling what they have. Yes, Jalen Coker. Yes, Xavier Legette. We're promising as rookies. Still need to see them end up doing not more necessarily, because they did a lot of good as rookies, but they got to continue to, of course, progress and take that next step in year two. Adam Thielen's been really good for Carolina. I would think that David Moore probably comes back as that fourth receiver right now. Add another veteran into that room, and you're probably feeling pretty good, or at least pretty all right. Let's not say pretty good, because it's not a good receiving room. It's an all right receiving room, but it could get a lot better. And there's guys out there like Luther Burden, who could make sense maybe for Carolina as a slot guy down the road. Matthew Golden, been asked about him a couple of times as an outside receiver at Texas down the stretch. He became the number one guy. Mecca Buka, who's the all-time leading receiver at The Ohio State University. And think about the guys that have come through Ohio State. Now, yeah, he's there for like 4 or 5 years, so that helps, but still produced. Good player. Trey Harris, who I loved him at Ole Miss. He started at UTSA, was at Ole Miss the last 2 years, had some injury issues this past season, but good big body kind of guy who can be a deep ball threat, play that X. He's a good player. So, of these guys like Burden, former 5-star, live it to the hype, think he's solid. Golden, think he's solid. I don't necessarily love this wide receiver group. If there's any one that I'm looking at where like, okay, that guy absolutely fits a need that Carolina has, it's Teteroa McMillan from the University of Arizona. He's 6'5", 210. Yeah, you look at a Legette who's got a big body. He's not 6'5", though. Carolina needs one of those kind of big body possession receivers who in the red zone, and that's kind of what JT Sanders was looking like he's going to turn into before that neck injury that kind of derailed the last half of the season in Carolina this past fall. That's kind of what he could be for Carolina as well. But I would love to have a receiver be that. And looking at what Lance Zierlein said about Teteroa McMillan, like I'm interested in this guy a big time. He says possession receiver with the size and ball skills create big wins deep. He's a linear route runner who wears press coverage early and coasts too often on deep routes, but he has a feel for uncovering underneath and can play over the top of cornerbacks for easier jump ball wins. McMillan is instinctive with a feel for adjusting his routes and working back on throws to make the quarterback's job easier. He needs to show more consistent play speed and physicality to protect his workspace. His elite ball skills set him apart, though providing a higher floor as a Z option with mismatch value in the slot. I don't know necessarily that he needs him in the slot, but we'll see if Dave wants to be creative and put him there, as he already has. Thielen can play slot. Coker. It's crazy because Coker, Legette, Thielen are probably all best in the slot, but only really one of them can play there for the most part. So Teteroa McMillan, I've seen him mocked 8th overall to Carolina. That would make sense. Safety, considering the amount of guys that are free agents, that would make a lot of sense too. But I would think, much like nose tackle, that needs to be addressed first and foremost in March with a veteran, Trevon Morwig, Javon Holland, names that we have brought up here on this show. They would make sense. Malachi Starks, Xavier Watts, Malachi Starks from Georgia, Watts from Notre Dame. Both of those guys are probably going in the first round. And I guess if Carolina trades back, they could be in play. But a lot would have to go wrong next month for that to make sense for me. Late April, if they want to later on. Nick Eamon-Worry from South Carolina could play his way in the first round, probably more of a second-round pick. Billy Bowman Jr. from Oklahoma, Kevin Winston Jr. from Penn State. Those are some other names of prospects to check out this weekend. Tight end. I have seen someone out there mention that tight end is their top need for Carolina at 8th overall. And I found it to be quite interesting, considering They just drafted one last year, but yeah, okay. JT Sanders was drafted in the 4th round, and he was second best tight end coming out of college behind Brock Bowers. Improved this past season as a rookie, was the second best tight end behind Brock Bowers by a significant margin, mind you, as far as rookie tight ends go. But Tommy Trimble, if he comes back, he's not going to be the pass catching tight end that Carolina is looking to utilize. He's going to be a blocker still. Ian Thomas, I'm guessing that's finally over for y'all's sake now. Carolina needs to address that. They're going to need to get a veteran, but getting someone in the draft would not be crazy. And Tyler Warren, I have seen this also. I think it was Eric Edholm of Yahoo who went out there and mocked Tyler Warren to Carolina. He had 104 receptions last year, 1,233 yards, and 8 touchdowns, and he was the Penn State offense. Penn State's receivers sucked last year. Tyler Warren was the dude. He lined up at center one time, snapped the ball, and caught a touchdown against USC. Like, go back, watch tape. It was crazy, the things that Andy Kolnicki, the OC there at Penn State, did for him last year. He's a dude, and I'm all for it. If you tell me you can have Warren and you can have JT Sanders over the next couple of seasons at tight end, I'm cool with that. Colston Loveland, been a good player at Michigan. Mason Taylor, the son of Hall of Famer Jason Taylor, he was a good player at LSU. Harold Fannin Jr., though, that's the other tight end from Bowling Green. Maybe you never heard of him. Maybe you have. He actually had the better stats when you look at him and Tyler Warren. 117 receptions, 1,555 yards, and 10 tutties playing in the MAC. So playing on Tuesday nights, on Wednesday nights, the dude was balling. So, yeah, Tyler Warren's good, but you want to talk about the most productive tight end in college football last year? It was Harold Fannin Jr. from Bowling Green. Go Falcons. Cornerback, not Atlanta, Bowling Green Falcons. Corner, that would be another position where Mike Jackson, I would guess, would be the favorite right now to start at that number 2 spot. Opposite of J.C. Horn, you're going to have Shaw Smith-Wade there in the nickel. He's penciled in right now. Going to have to win that spot, but I would guess it would be J.C. and Shaw, who are both solidified as starters as of this recording on February 24th, a Monday, heading into the Combine week. So I would guess that would be the case. Now, Mike Jackson, would love to see him come back. Would love to see Carolina look at some other options as well. If they don't bring back Mike Jackson, there's still a hole there. Then, yeah, you're going to look at the draft. And there's 2 guys that I do think are good players. It's just going to come down to, does Carolina want to draft another guy recovering from an ACL tear? And that's Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame, who was their best corner until he got hurt. And that's Siobhan Ravel from ECU, who obviously was their best corner and one of the best in college football until he got hurt. And those are 2 guys that were considered first-round prospects, but right now are likely second-round guys. So that's the conversation we had. We talked about the last year when Carolina went out there and drafted Jonathan Brooks. And, yeah, right now it's not going great. Do you want to do that again? Every player's different. Have to understand that. TD, Thomas Davis had plenty of his issues and ended up being a great player for Carolina when it was all said and done. It's just, that's one curious thing to think about. AZ Thomas from Florida State, he's another guy I like a lot. Trey Amos from Ole Miss by way of Louisiana. He's really a Louisiana Lafayette Raging Cajun more than he's an Ole Miss Rebel. But the reps paid him enough to go there. But he's a guy also who could start an outside corner, who I think is a really good player. So corner, would not hate to see it. Tight end, safety, wide receiver as well. A couple more before I close out here that could make sense. Now, these 2 are going to make sense late in the draft. Don't do this before the 6th. Like, these are 7th-round picks. Kicker and punter. Pinheiro, I don't feel confident that he's going to be back as Panthers kicker. They got Matthew Wright signed to a futures contract. He's had opportunities in Carolina. He's had opportunities across the league. Maybe it's finally his time to be a kicker. But I would think maybe drafting someone, certainly going to bring in another rookie like they did last year of Harrison Mevis, the thicker kicker from Mizzou. But if they want to draft a kicker, okay, it would make sense, or at least could make sense. Punter, same case. Johnny Hecker, free agent. Would not mind them getting younger. If they want to go younger, both kicker and punter. Can be a tad bit risky. We have seen young guys come in and be really good. What's it? Evan McPherson up there in Cincinnati was a rookie when he's making all those kicks under road to the Super Bowl. We've seen Jake Elliott do the same in Philadelphia. So just because he's a rookie does not mean that guy can't come out there and compete. It's the same case with every position group. Teams rely on rookie quarterbacks. They rely on rookie receivers and all of that to make plays, and we see those guys step up and do it. So kicker, punter, I can't ignore their ability to do it as well. Linebacker could make sense. Trevin Wallace should be in there as a starting linebacker coming in next year. Same thing with Josie Jewell. Josie could be the starter next 2 seasons, especially if Ejiro Evero comes back for a new contract, the 4th year in 2026. But he's not the long-term option in Carolina. Trevin Wallace is still trying to prove he's going to be a long-term option. But right now, that would certainly appear to be the plan for this staff in front office. And if they want to draft somebody else and have them wait in the wings and then be able to start in 2026, could make sense. And then center. I'm thinking Austin Corbett comes back on a slight deal. Same thing as far as restricted free agent tender. When looking at Cade Mays, have those guys duke it out. I had talked a lot about this last draft season when looking at a guy like Jackson Powers Johnson and Zach Frazier, both of those guys coming out of Oregon and West Virginia, respectively, as Panthers had not drafted a center since they took Ryan Khalil. Why not do it this year if you think that maybe you can find somebody else? But I do think Cade Mays, the way he played, his relationship with Bryce, he would be the guy to be the favorite to start at center and be that long-term option for you. And he's someone that you drafted. Yeah, you cut him, but you brought him back and he performed. So drafting a center could make sense based off of what happens again next month, which starts on Saturday in March in free agency, which free agency doesn't start on Saturday, but March starts on Saturday, just to make that clear. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to check me out on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays answer your weekly Friday mailbag questions here on the show. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding in. The hope is tomorrow I'll have a draft expert on to talk about what's going on this week and trying to get a couple guests on this week. So stay tuned for all that here on Tuesday and the rest of the week on Locked On Panthers.